Let's talk about thick paint done digitally. When digital 2D painting packages were first created, they all adopted the principle of repeatedly stamping a shape. If the stamped images are close enough together, then they tend to blur into a brush shape. Now, basic shapes like a hard round brush, soft round brush, or a very soft airbrush, combined with basic controls for colour, size and opacity, form the backbone of most digital art packages. Many people still strongly advocate learning to paint digitally with just these three brush types, and you can really produce some amazing work with very little else. But people like myself, coming from a traditional background, started to complain that the brushes felt too digital. They were too smooth and linear looking and didn't have the imperfections and qualities of paper and canvas and paint. They just didn't look or feel real. Now, most art packages quickly adopted some form of grain into the brush engine. So if the stamp shape is the maximum amount of paint that can be put down, then the grain is a way to subtract some of that to introduce patterns and a little bit of randomness into the brush strokes. Brushes immediately felt more natural and organic, with papery or canvas-like textures starting to come through. However, when you looked more closely, the textures didn't look particularly real because there was no surface structure. There weren't any ripples or bumps or divots. There was no surface lighting. There was no shadows. So as digital programs introduced layers and layer blending effects, people quickly realised that overlay blending could allow photos of textures to be placed on top for even more convincing surface quality and structures. Now, this works very well for subtle and repeating textures like a watercolour paper, and it's how people can get more realistic effects on software that doesn't include a canvas mechanism such as Procreate on the iPad. An overlay texture is just a photograph of a texture, usually in black and white, which is placed above the art, and then the blending mode is turned to overlay. It can be soft and simple textures, like a watercolour paper, or it can be dramatic, thick, chunky textures. If you've seen anything on my channel, then you probably know that I like thick impasto textures in my art. And while the overlay can look good at an initial glance, there are several issues that start to appear. The thicker and more pronounced the overlay texture, the more it seems to become separate from the painting underneath. The texture hasn't been built up by the paint strokes, and the paint strokes haven't interacted with the texture. So you start to realise that they're two separate, disconnected elements. And that becomes even more pronounced if you paint underneath a thick texture. It just doesn't feel quite right, at least not to a traditional artist like myself anyway. Now, as art programs developed, they kind of split into two, what I would call the digital packages, and then there's the traditional simulators. Now, one of the key things that differentiates a traditional simulator program from something like Procreate on the iPad is the inclusion of a canvas or a surface to paint on. So programs like Infinite Painter or Rebel allow you to select a canvas surface, and then when you paint on it, the brush seems to interact with the texture. The surface is also lit with highlights and shadows, and it feels more dimensional. It feels like a much more realistic painting experience. But again, this generally works best for simple textures like watercolour and canvas. It starts to break down for big, chunky textures with large shadows. To understand why, we need to look at what the program is doing. And most programs will have one or more sliders to control the canvas. So Infinite Painter, for example, has depth and opacity. So the depth controls how hard the brush must work to push colour into the texture. And they recently reversed the slider, so now a low value means that the brush only pushes lightly into the texture, and it's hard work to fill the deep areas. The surface feels very textured, whereas a high value means that the brush easily pushes paint into even the deepest texture. And this controls how thick the texture feels to paint on. And the other slider controls the opacity of the texture. It's effectively a built-in overlay layer, and it controls how thick the texture looks, as the opacity is really an approximation for the thickness. So what the program is doing is using a texture, either a built-in one that comes with the program or one that you provide yourself, and then using it in two ways. So one as a built-in overlay layer with opacity controls, and secondly as a height map for the brush to interact with. If you're watching this video, then I'm sure that you're familiar with the classic lit sphere demonstration that shows a single light on a sphere with the light side, the terminator, the dark side, and the cast shadow. And when we apply that lighting scheme to the gently rippling surface of a texture, then we can see that the highlight is almost at the top and the shadow is almost at the bottom. So the photo of the surface approximates a height map. Now, depending on the brush pressure combined with the texture depth control, the program can then work out if a particular brush pressure should interact with any given pixel. But it isn't perfect. The highlight isn't actually the highest point of the texture, and some deep points are quite light, and the shadow can appear to be all at the same depth. So this approximation gets even worse as the texture gets more pronounced, particularly when you start to get big cast shadows from very thick texture. Bits of texture get lost, and the shadow becomes effectively a large flat hole in the painting, which just looks wrong. So by understanding what a height map should look like, I've been experimenting with a technique that creates a separate height map texture based on an overlay texture. So I start with a texture that I've made myself, traditionally. And yeah, I know, real paint is so last year. And then I photograph it. Now, one thing to be aware of when you're photographing a texture is something called light fall off. The worst way to photograph it is with a soft light very close to the texture. You'll get a very bright corner nearest the light and progressively darker texture as you get further away from the light, thanks to what's called the inverse square law. Double the distance doesn't just half the light, it quarters it. The best way to photograph the texture is to have a very strong light very far away. Now, I'm from Scotland, so I don't see it very often, but there's this thing called the sun. And if you can photograph the texture in direct sunlight at a suitable angle, you will get the most consistent light, but make sure your camera can handle the highlights. It is also best to paint the texture a neutral grey rather than white so that you get a better dynamic range when you take the photo. If the light is more diffuse, so say a cloudy day, or if you are using indoor lighting, then you may have to try and correct for that light fall off. I do this by adding a strip of 50% grey to visually balance against, and then duplicating the texture layer. Then I use curves to adjust it so the lighter parts are now dark enough, and then I use a mask layer to apply a gradient to visually balance out as best I can. So now I have a black and white photo of the texture that is on average 50% grey, which will be the visual overlay layer that I use. What I then do is process the texture with curves to get a starting point where most of the texture is much darker to represent deeper surface. I can then manually highlight and paint on the high points of the texture. Now, this is a slow process, but after a few hours I have a manually created height map for the texture. The final challenge is to work out the scaling, as programs tend to scale and place the canvas in slightly unexpected ways. So the overlay image will import as expected, filling the image, but the canvas texture may be larger or smaller and may be offset. So there is a little bit of trial and error to scale and resize the height map image to perfectly align with the overlay. And they do need to align perfectly or you will get a weird double vision texture. It's a bit like you've had one whiskey too many. That's not a good look for you or the texture. But if you can get all that set up correctly, then what you can get is some really complex textures where the brush will feel much more realistic in the way that it interacts with the height of the texture. Light strokes will really emphasize the texture and pick out the shapes of the texture much more realistically. And it will feel like you have to push paint into the low areas. As an extra trick, I create a mask of texture shapes by carefully cutting them out from the texture. Adding this and then locking the alpha, you can then paint solid swatches of paint that will align perfectly, not just with the texture, but with a single brush mark, which further enhances the sense of realism. It feels like these textured marks were genuinely added individually. And then finally, it's possible to add some bounce light into the texture shadows by using curves. So for example, to add some red light into the shadow, you select the red curve and then carefully add a little extra light into the dark values. And that works best if you make sure your image is zoomed in a little bit so that you can see the effect of the light in the shadows as you adjust the curve. Of course, I should emphasize that the limitation of this method is that the texture is really fixed from the start and that your brush strokes won't actually change the texture itself, only the colour. What we really need is a program with genuine impasto paint, which will be the subject of part 2 of this video. I've tried for years, if not decades, to try and get convincing, thick overlay textures to allow me to get more realistic digital paintings similar to my traditional work. It's not perfect, but I think this is about as close as I can get with just overlay textures alone. But what do you think? Does that look convincing to you? I'm actually considering doing a Patreon to share some of the underlying resources like handmade textures, height maps, brushes, etc. So let me know in the comments below if that's something that you might be interested in. In the next video, I'll take a look at Rebelle 7 and try to make the most realistic digital textures that I can with it using thick impasto brushes and other techniques. So until then, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.